The city no longer looked alive. Snow drifted through the ruins of Stalingrad like ash from a dying world burned-out tram. Cars sat frozen in the streets. Apartment blocks stood hollowed open to the winter sky. Somewhere beyond the shattered city, Soviet artillery thundered without pause. The sound never stopped anymore. German soldiers huddled inside collapsed basements and ruined factories, waiting for the next bombardment to hit. Dust fell from cracked ceilings. Men slept beside corpses because there was nowhere else to place the dead. Near the Volga River, a young German radio operator sat wrapped in blankets, stiff with frozen blood. Then suddenly, the artillery stopped. The silence felt worse. The radio operator froze as a transmission crackled through the static. Soviet armored forces had linked north and south of the city. The escape routes were gone. The Sixth Army was surrounded, one soldier slowly removed his helmet. Another pulled a photograph of his wife from inside his coat and stared at it without speaking. And in that freezing basement beneath the ruins of Stalingrad, the men of the Sixth Army realized something terrifying. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive, and many already knew they would never leave the city alive. If you enjoy cinematic World War II documentaries that explore fear, survival, and hidden human stories behind history's darkest battles, subscribe and join Warlens for more immersive journeys into the moments that changed the world forever. Stalingrad was not just another battle, it became the graveyard of an army, the turning point of World War II, and the moment Nazi Germany's image of invincibility began to collapse. Before Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. German forces had crushed Poland, overwhelmed France, and driven deep into Soviet territory with terrifying speed. Across Europe, entire nations fell beneath the force of blitzkrieg. Many German soldiers entered the Soviet Union believing victory was only a matter of time, but Russia was different. The distances were endless, the resistance grew harder, and the deeper the Germans advanced, the more the war began, consuming men, fuel supplies, and hope. Then in the summer of 1942, Hitler focused on a city along the Volga River that carried the name of Stalin himself. Stalingrad German commanders expected another victory. Instead, they marched directly into one of the deadliest traps in military history. The Luftwaffe began bombing Stalingrad in August 1942. Entire districts vanished beneath firestorms. Apartment buildings collapsed into the streets. Smoke covered the city for days, while thousands of civilians died beneath the rubble. But the destruction created something the Germans never expected: a battlefield built for defense. Every shattered factory became a fortress. Every ruined apartment block became a sniper position. Every sewer tunnel became a hidden path for Soviet counterattacks. German soldiers who once relied on speed and coordinated assaults suddenly found themselves trapped in brutal close quarters combat, where battles were measured in rooms instead of miles, inside the Red October factory and the Barricadi industrial complex. Men fought through smoke, dust, and darkness with grenades, knives, flamethrowers, and bare hands. One floor of a building might belong to the Germans, while Soviet troops waited directly beneath them in the basement. Sometimes the enemy stood only feet away behind broken walls. Sleep disappeared. So did certainty. The Germans still believed victory remained possible. Officers assured exhausted troops that Soviet resistance was collapsing. Reinforcements continued arriving. Propaganda promised the city would soon fall completely. But Stalingrad consumed everything sent into it, and with winter approaching, the city slowly began turning into a graveyard. By October, the temperature began falling fast. Cold rain turned the shattered streets of Stalingrad into rivers of mud thick enough to swallow boots and vehicles whole. Then the first heavy snow arrived, covering burned tanks, collapsed buildings, and frozen corpses beneath layers of white. Winter had come to Stalingrad, and winter did not care about rank medals or ideology. German soldiers had never expected to still be fighting there by the end of the year. Many units still wore thin autumn uniforms completely unsuited for the brutal Russian cold. Some wrapped newspapers around their feet for insulation. Others tied blankets around their shoulders with telephone wire. Men searched dead bodies for gloves, scarves, and boots before the corpses froze, too hard to strip. At night, temperatures dropped so low that rifles jammed from ice truck engines froze. Solid oil thickened inside machinery. Even simple tasks became exhausting. A soldier trying to reload ammunition with numb fingers could lose feeling in his hands. Within minutes, fuel shortages crippled transportation across the city. Supply convoys struggled through snow-covered ruins, while Soviet artillery hammered the roads leading into Stalingrad. Horses collapsed in the streets from exhaustion and hunger. Abandoned vehicles lined frozen alleyways like rusting skeletons buried beneath snowdrifts. Food became scarce, then it became precious. Bread rations shrank smaller every week. Soldiers boiled watery soup over tiny fires built from broken furniture ripped out of destroyed apartments. Some units slaughtered horses for meat, while others searched ruined buildings for frozen scraps left behind months earlier. The wounded suffered. Most German field hospitals overflowed with frostbite cases, burns, infections, and shattered limbs. Medics worked inside freezing basements lit by candles, while artillery dust drifted from the ceiling onto operating tables. Morphine supplies ran dangerously low. Many wounded soldiers died simply because their bodies no longer had the strength to survive the cold. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance only intensified every night. Red Army reinforcements crossed the Volga River through darkness. Artillery fire and floating sheets of ice. German machine gunners watched shadowy figures emerge from the freezing fog again and again, no matter how many Soviet troops died trying to cross. The battle began to feel endless. Then came November 19th, 1942. Before dawn, the frozen horizon erupted in fire. Thousands of Soviet artillery guns opened fire across the northern and southern flanks surrounding Stalingrad. The bombardment rolled across the steppe like continuous thunder, shaking bunkers and sending terrified soldiers stumbling awake into the darkness. Many German troops initially believed it was another localized Soviet attack. It was much bigger than that. The Red Army had spent months preparing a massive counteroffensive. In secret, instead of striking the heavily defended German forces inside Stalingrad itself, Soviet commanders targeted the weaker Romanian and Italian armies guarding the flanks outside the city. The attack hit with overwhelming force. Soviet tanks burst through snowstorms and shattered defensive lines within hours. Entire units collapsed under the pressure. Communication lines failed almost immediately. Telephone wires disappeared beneath explosions and ice, while desperate radio operators struggled to understand the scale of the disaster unfolding around them. Inside Stalingrad, confusion spread rapidly. Reports arriving at headquarters sounded impossible. Enemy armor advancing behind German positions, supply routes under attack, entire flank divisions disappearing from contact. Junior officers stared at maps in disbelief as Soviet spearheads pushed deeper, westward, moving toward each other with terrifying speed. Then panic started spreading through the city. Supply convoys vanished on the roads outside Stalingrad. Refugees, wounded soldiers, and retreating units clogged the frozen routes. Leading west, trucks ran out of fuel and sat abandoned in the snow while artillery exploded around them. Some German commanders immediately understood the danger. The Soviets were not simply attacking, they were closing a trap inside ruined bunkers and factory positions. Ordinary soldiers sensed something had changed even before official orders arrived. Rumors spread through trenches and basements late into the night. The roads were being cut off. The Soviets were behind them. The army might be surrounded. Then on November 23rd, Soviet armored forces linked near the town of Kalash. The encirclement was complete. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops inside Stalingrad suddenly found themselves trapped inside a frozen pocket hundreds of miles from Germany. And as snow swept across the ruins of the city, many soldiers began asking the same terrifying question. How were they supposed to get out? At first, many German soldiers still believed the encirclement would only last a few days. The Wehrmacht had escaped dangerous situations before. Officers assured their men that relief forces would reopen the corridor. Soon, propaganda broadcasts continued speaking confidently about temporary setbacks and heroic resistance, but inside Stalingrad reality already looked very different. The roads west were gone. Soviet artillery now controlled nearly every major supply. Route fuel dumps burned across the frozen steppe while abandoned. Trucks and dead horses lined the snow-covered roads outside the city. The Sixth Army was trapped. General Friedrich Paulus understood the danger immediately. Several German commanders urged an immediate breakout while fuel and ammunition still remained. If the army moved quickly, parts of it might still escape before Soviet defenses hardened, but the order never came. Hitler refused retreat. Instead, he demanded the Sixth Army hold Stalingrad at all costs. He promised the Luftwaffe would keep the trapped army supplied by air until relief forces arrived. For the exhausted men inside the pocket, the promise became the last fragile piece of hope left. But it was based on fantasy. The Sixth Army needed hundreds of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies every single day just to survive. Winter storms, Soviet anti-aircraft fire, and mechanical failures made those deliveries almost impossible. Soon transport aircraft started falling from the sky. Some crashed during blizzards before reaching the city. Others exploded under Soviet fire while trying to land on frozen airstrips surrounded by artillery bombardment. Every lost plane meant less food, less medicine, less hope. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Bread rations became dangerously. Small soldiers slaughtered the remaining horses for meat starving. Troops searched frozen ruins for anything edible, while wounded men filled overcrowded basements that barely functioned as hospitals anymore. The psychological pressure grew heavier. Each day, men stopped talking about victory. Then they stopped talking about home letters from Germany arrived less often. Radios continued broadcasting speeches about sacrifice and endurance, but the soldiers listening inside frozen bunkers no longer believed the voices speaking to them at night. Soviet artillery pounded the shrinking German positions while loudspeakers echoed through the ruins. "You are surrounded. You have been abandoned. Save yourselves." Some soldiers laughed bitterly when they heard the messages. Others sat silently because deep down they feared the Soviets were telling the truth. And as December tightened its grip around Stalingrad, one reality became impossible to ignore. The Sixth Army was not preparing for rescue anymore. It was slowly starving to death. By December 1942, survival inside Stalingrad had become a daily struggle against hunger, cold, and exhaustion. The city no longer resembled a battlefield. It resembled the aftermath of the end of the world. Snow buried the ruins beneath a pale, frozen silence, broken only by artillery fire and the cries of wounded men echoing through collapsed buildings. Smoke drifted constantly above the city, while starving soldiers wandered between shattered positions, searching for food, firewood, or anything that might keep them alive another night. Bread rations shrank to almost nothing. Some soldiers received only a few ounces a day. Horse meat became precious. Men hacked frozen flesh from dead animals lying in the streets and boiled it into thin soup over fires fueled by broken furniture and scraps of wood ripped from ruined homes. Others grew more desperate. Troops searched the pockets of dead comrades for crumbs. Some boiled leather belts and equipment in water just to silence hunger pains. Everywhere inside the pocket, bodies weakened. Rapidly, faces became hollow, eyes sank deep into exhausted skulls. Uniforms hung loose over men who had already lost dangerous amounts of weight. The wounded suffered terribly. German field. Hospitals collapsed under the sheer number of casualties. Basements packed with injured soldiers smelled of blood infection, smoke, and decay. Medics worked with almost no medicine. Left amputations were performed without proper anesthesia while exhausted. Doctors operated beside flickering candles as artillery dust drifted from the ceiling. Frostbite spread everywhere. Hands blackened, feet froze solid inside boots. Some soldiers woke beside dead comrades whose bodies had stiffened during the night from exposure, and still, Hitler continued ordering the Sixth Army to hold its ground. No retreat, no surrender. By January 1943, Stalingrad had become a prison of ice, starvation, and silence. The Sixth Army was collapsing, not all at once, but slowly, day by day, man by man. The final airfields inside the pocket were falling under constant Soviet attack. Supply planes arrived less often now, and when they did, many carried far too little to matter. Some landed with ammunition, but no food. Others never landed at all, disappearing into snowstorms or crashing in flames beyond the city. Each failed delivery, destroyed morale. Further, inside the ruins, soldiers no longer fought for victory. Most no longer believed in rescue. They fought simply because stopping meant death. Starvation dominated every thought. Men argued over crumbs of bread. Wounded soldiers begged medics to let them die because they no longer had the strength to endure another night in the cold. Some troops chewed candle wax or cigarette filters just to silence the pain in their stomachs. And then came the realization many survivors never forgot. Not a dramatic speech, not one single moment, just a slow, crushing certainty spreading through the army like frost. For some soldiers, it came when the last functioning airfield fell silent. For others, it came during endless Soviet bombardments when German artillery could no longer answer back because ammunition was nearly gone. One radio operator later remembered listening to broadcasts from Germany describing heroic resistance while men around him froze to death in darkness. Another soldier recalled watching officers burn documents instead of planning escape. That was the moment he understood. Nobody was coming. The Sixth Army had been abandoned inside collapsed factories and frozen basements. Exhausted soldiers finally confronted the truth they had spent weeks trying to deny. They were never leaving. Stalingrad, some men cried openly. Others became strangely calm. A few continued following orders mechanically because routine was the only thing keeping them sane. But deep beneath the exhaustion and fear, the same realization haunted nearly everyone still alive inside the pocket. This was no longer a battle. It was the final days of a doomed army waiting to disappear beneath the snow. By the end of January 1943, the Sixth Army barely resembled an army anymore. It looked like a collection of starving ghosts wandering through frozen ruin. German positions had collapsed into isolated pockets scattered across the city. Soviet forces advanced building by building, basement by basement, crushing what little resistance remained beneath overwhelming artillery and constant attacks. The men defending those ruins were exhausted beyond human limits. Many could barely stand. Faces had become hollow from starvation, beards, covered frostbitten skin uniforms hung. From bodies reduced by hunger and disease, soldiers wrapped blankets around themselves beneath torn winter coats while clutching rifles with numb, frozen hands. Some had not eaten properly in weeks. Others no longer cared whether they survived. Inside overcrowded shelters, wounded men lay packed side by side across frozen floors. The smell of blood infection, smoke, and death filled the underground rooms where medics worked without supplies, heat, or hope. Outside, Soviet loudspeakers echoed through the city night after night. You are surrounded. You have been abandoned. Save yourselves. This time, nobody laughed because everyone knew it was true. Even senior commanders understood. The end had arrived. On January 30th, Hitler promoted General Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. The message carried an unspoken expectation behind it. No German field marshal had ever surrendered before. Hitler expected Paulus to fight to the death or kill himself, but inside Stalingrad ideology meant nothing anymore. The 6th Army was dying. Entire units vanished beneath Soviet attacks. Without replacement ammunition, ran dangerously low, radios failed, frozen corpses filled stairwells, alleyways, and collapsed bunkers across the city. One officer later described the final days as waiting for extinction. Then the Soviet assaults reached the army headquarters itself. German soldiers emerged slowly from ruined buildings with their hands raised, too weak to continue fighting. Others remained beside machine guns until Soviet troops finally overwhelmed their positions. Some died from shell fire. Some died from cold. Some simply laid down in the snow and never stood again. And then, on February 2nd, 1943, the battle ended. The once powerful 6th Army had ceased to exist. Nearly 3,000 Axis troops entered the Stalingrad campaign. Only a fraction would ever return home. The destruction of the 6th Army sent shockwaves across the world. Until Stalingrad, Nazi Germany had seemed unstoppable. Across Europe, the Wehrmacht built a reputation for speed, discipline, and relentless victory. Entire nations had collapsed before it in only weeks. But beside the frozen banks of the Volga River, that image died. An entire German field army had been destroyed, not pushed back, not temporarily defeated, destroyed across. Occupied Europe resistance movements suddenly saw something they had not felt in years. Hope inside Germany, the reaction felt very different. Official propaganda tried to portray Stalingrad as a heroic sacrifice, but millions of families already understood the truth. Letters stopped arriving. Sons, husbands, and fathers had vanished somewhere inside a ruined Soviet city. Most Germans had never even heard of. Before the war, entire communities waited for news that never came. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became more than a military victory. It became proof that Germany could bleed, proof that the Red Army could survive, and proof that the war had finally begun turning against Hitler. From that point forward, the German military would never fully recover the momentum it lost inside Stalingrad. The war continued for more than 2 brutal years, but something fundamental had changed. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing toward victory. Now it was fighting to avoid collapse. For the survivors, who eventually returned from Soviet prison camps years later, the memories never truly disappeared. Many rarely spoke about Stalingrad because the city had stripped away everything except raw human survival, hunger, cold, fear, exhaustion, and the terrible realization of what happens when armies are driven beyond the limits of endurance by leaders who refuse to accept reality. Stalingrad was not destroyed in a single moment. The city died slowly, street by street, building by building, soldier by soldier. What began as another confident German advance into Soviet territory turned into one of the greatest military disasters in modern history. But beyond the maps, casualty numbers and battlefield strategies, Stalingrad became something far more haunting, a human collapse inside. The frozen ruins. Ordinary men faced conditions so brutal that survival itself became the only objective left. Hunger replaced ideology, exhaustion replaced patriotism, and fear slowly consumed whatever confidence remained inside the Sixth Army. Of the soldiers trapped, there were not fanatics or famous commanders. They were young infantrymen medics, radio operators, drivers men who believed they would eventually return home. Instead, they found themselves abandoned inside a city that seemed designed to erase human beings completely, and perhaps that is why Stalingrad still feels so disturbing decades later, because it revealed how quickly pride, ambition, and blind obedience can drag entire armies toward destruction, while ordinary people pay the price beneath the ruins. The snow eventually melted over Stalingrad. The guns eventually fell silent, but the memory of what happened there never disappeared. Not for Germany, not for Russia, and not for history. The end, Stalingrad did not destroy the Sixth Army in one sudden catastrophe. The city broke it slowly through cold, starvation, exhaustion, and the crushing realization that no rescue would ever come beneath the frozen ruins. Along the Volga, hundreds of thousands of soldiers discovered the true cost of pride, blind obedience, and total war. And even now, decades later, the silence of Stalingrad still echoes with the memory of men who understood too late that they had already been condemned